Hello, welcome to another Thinkers50 curated session. I'm Des Dearlove.
And I'm Stuart Craner, and we are the founders of Thinkers50, the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking and sharing the leading management ideas of our age.
Our belief in the power of ideas has been the foundation of our work since we launched the first ever global ranking of management thinkers in 2001. And we've published a new Thinkers50 ranking every 2 years since. It remains, I'm pleased to say, the premier ranking of its kind.
So we are excited that 2021, a year in which fresh thinking and human ingenuity are more important than ever, is also a Thinkers50 year. Nominations are now open for both the ranking of management thinkers and the Distinguished Achievement Awards, which the Financial Times, no less, calls the Oscars of management thinking.
The awards shortlist will be announced on the 2nd of August, and the year's finale on the 15th and 16th of November will bring all the excitement of a new ranking and the naming of our Thinkers50 2021 award winners.
Our guest today is another brilliant member of the Thinkers50 radar community of up and coming thinkers. Ruchika Tulshyan is an award-winning inclusion strategist who is passionate about designing equitable workplaces. Through her company Candor, she advises companies on diversity, equity and inclusion strategy and communications.
Ruchika is a keynote speaker who has addressed audiences as diverse as Microsoft, Amazon, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and US Congress, and many more. Her book, The Diversity Advantage, Fixing Gender Inequality in the Workplace, focuses on leadership strategies to advance women at work. She's currently working on her second book, Inclusion on Purpose, which will be out in spring 2022.
Ruchika is a former journalist. She also writes regularly for the New York Times and Harvard Business Review on workplace equity. She's also the inaugural Distinguished Professional in Residence for Seattle University. In 2019, Ruchika was named to the Thinkers50 on the radar list.
So we have 30 minutes with Ruchika, so please send in your questions at any time and let us know where you are joining us from. Ruchika, welcome.
Thank you so much. And both of you, can I be the one to correct you? My name is Ruchika with a ch. But I'm
going to blame Stuart because he's
I know both of you. Yes, I know both of you. And I'm thank you. And I'm only doing this because I've written about it. So
it's not the first time, that we've got names wrong. So sorry. Apologies.
Okay, thank you.
So let's start with it. You had an article in the New York Times recently, which is a really good platform for management ideas, about return to the office. Just give us a taste of that article.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been hearing from a lot of communities that are largely underrepresented in the workplace that there's quite a lot of fear about returning back to the office, right? We've been working remotely for those of us who have the privilege and ability to work from home, including myself. The last 18 months have been transformative in many ways. Definitely a lot of challenge, a lot of pain, a lot of, trying to adjust to this new normal, whatever it is. And now to feel like that is going to be yanked away by, leaders who will say, nope, you need to return back to the office on this date, right? At a time where there's still a lot of uncertainty about this pandemic, about how it's affecting people, the new variants. And so when I pitched this article to my editor, I said, I think the group that's most impacted, there's a lot of research around how women have, as a larger group, have experienced this pandemic and returning back to the office. We've had a great, unfortunate recession of women specifically leaving the US workplace here in the US. And so when I pitched it to my editor, I said, I really want to focus on what it's like to have two underrepresented identities and what's the experience of being a woman of color throughout the pandemic working life, and then what it feels like to have to contend with this thought of going back, because a lot of employers here have actually announced exact return dates. Some have said, you to come back the whole time. Some have said 3 days a week. Some have said you can remain remote indefinitely. And what I found, in this article is that largely women of color are not ready to return back to the office. And apart from the usual, transport and juggling sort of childcare and all of that, which we know isn't a women's issue, but really a societal issue. But apart from all of that, there is also a fear of having to return to the office and facing bias and facing microaggressions. One professor, Dr. Courtney McClooney, I'm sure the Thinkers50 is very well aware of Dr. McClooney's work, talked about how, as a Black woman, the last 18 months has been the first time in her career that she's not had her hair touched, and not felt that sense of being physically othered in the workplace. So it was a really, I'm really glad I wrote the piece. I heard from women really around the world contending with similar issues and wondering, are employers going to listen to my voice? Are they going to hear my perspective? And can they consider this perspective as they make grand announcements about returning back to the office?
And was that, I mean, you said you obviously talked to people all over the world. Was the experience, was it a universal experience, or was it very different in different locations?
Yeah, so for the article, I specifically talked to US-based women, but yes, once the article was out, a lot of our reader feedback really comes from very global, for people, from women and women of color around the world. And there was quite a commonality in that experience of feeling worried about returning back to the office, maybe hearing comments that, you had to put up with for years, and then for 18 months you've kind of had respite from it, and then now the thought of going back again was very worrisome to quite a few women. And this tells me a number of things, right? This tells me that that I think the most important thing is, how do we create an office culture where everyone feels welcome, safe, secure, like they belong, where they feel psychological safety, homage to Dr. Amy Edmondson's work, but where they feel that sense of, I can surface ideas, I can challenge the status quo, and I still have, I won't face retaliation for it. And I wrote about Dr. Edmondson's work as well for another New York Times article about how women specifically often lack psychological safety in the workplace and often feel like they can't take that risk and speak up or even surface ideas even that are sort of half-baked the way their male counterparts can. And so to me, writing this next follow-up on how women of color are thinking about returning to the office, it did remind me that, yes, indeed, for a lot of women of color, they lack that psychological safety. Many talked about, some of the women I actually interviewed, talked about how the more virtual environment actually created a more equitable and level playing field, right? You're the same size in the squares, your name is there, like sometimes in meetings, your name can be forgotten or whatnot, or you're completely overlooked. But in this, you can actually chime in, you can raise like a virtual hand. So there are opportunities there were opportunities created by the virtual environment that were actually lacking in the physical office space. So especially when I'm looking into, again, I take a lot of guidance from Dr. Sadal Neely, but when we look at Dr. Neely's work, there are opportunities here as we return to the office. So that to me tells me that, let's really think about what are those strategies as we get folks back into the office or expect them to. How can we create an environment that feels welcoming to all?
Yeah, I suppose the issue is just because we had a hiatus of 18 months, the issues that were there in the first place haven't gone away. But what surprised you about the way it's playing out?
Yeah, I think what surprised me, or actually I think just reinforced, what I was sort of hearing anecdotally. So Slack has a think tank called Future Forum. Slack, yes, the has become sort of everyone's device of choice or platform of choice to connect with coworkers. But they have a think tank called Future Forum, and they surveyed workers and found that 97% of Black workers do not want to return back to the office, right? And that number is significantly lower for white workers. And so I think less surprised, but very, very glad that the data backs this up. And I think that was, again, for a number of years, it wasn't a conversation you could really have in polite company, right? It wasn't something you could really surface to your boss. And now, I think, again, linked to this pandemic, which I think has made a lot of us a lot more vulnerable with each other. You know, when you have children and pets and whatnot running into your meetings, you're bringing people into your home. So there's a level of familiarity and vulnerability you anyway create, which is very different from going into the office, putting on your armor, putting on all those layers, you know, when you go in, your professional self. So there's that. I think the other thing which I think has really allowed us to come to this moment where we can have these conversations more freely is the racial justice movement that was kicked off last year in the United States and continues to, you know, have ripple effects right now and really across the world as well. One thing that I observed, which I was really surprised about, is people around the world are talking about local incidents of racial injustice, of, you know, ability to create a more inclusive society, you know, very much inspired by what happened here in the United States after the murder of George Floyd. And I think that was very inspiring for me, because for a number of years, what I was hearing is, you know, these movements are only rooted in the United States. And I'm sure, you know, for the two of you in the United Kingdom and really around the world, what I was hearing is actually, for the first time in a while, there was a local application to how do these issues impact us. You know, I'm from Singapore. I was hearing from my Singaporean friends, you know, that, hey, for the first time, we're actually having really deep conversations about how inequity and racial inequity and racism plays out in our own society. And normally we don't really talk about that in any sort of larger scale, but that was happening.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So Rajneesh from New Delhi is asking, so, I mean, people have got to go, we've got to manage this move back, or this hybrid situation. So what sort of, you know, what would be your recommendations for, you know, for leaders as they try to make the transition back?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first thing that I'm seeing, you know, innovative organizations and leaders do is actually survey their employees and actually find out, how are people doing? Are they comfortable with this idea of coming back? If not, what would be the best way to work with them, to engage with them, and then actually take action on that? Because what we find with a lot of surveying and data gathering is people do it as a check the box. You know, we ran a survey and then the data comes back and no action is taken based on that. Now, of course, if people say, you know, I never want to come back to the office, and that's just not something, you know, your organization just cannot operate that way. Although I think it's important to also think about how the last 18 months were for the organization. And I think for a lot of companies, it was actually a blockbuster year in many ways, right? By reducing some of the friction to innovation, to productivity. So I think that's something to look at. But I think without surveying how your employees are feeling, I don't think we're really going to be able to plan an inclusive return to office. So again, gather the data, but also run the analysis and work towards incorporating what you read and what you see. So I think that's very important. I recommend anonymous surveys. So again, people who are historically underrepresented won't stick out like the sore thumb. Oh, this one woman on this one male-dominated team feels this way, and so you should go face penalization and retaliation for that. So I think that's really important. And then when planning this sort of return to office idea, I think it is important to look at what are the practices today that could be exclusionary. Our conference rooms, for example, are they friendly to people with disabilities? Are they accommodating to people with disabilities? Things like that. Is there an opportunity to create a more hybrid environment? So not everyone's rushing back at the same time, but there are people who can work remotely and are not going to get penalized for doing so. So I think there are ways that we can do that. I do recommend that employees, get a chance to chime in and really be part of the workforce and part of those decisions, because I think for too long they weren't. And I think that we've seen the tension simmering. I mean, most of the thinkers and the folks on Thinkers50 that I've ever connected with have talked about this tension, this simmering feeling like, we want more from our workplace. Looking at Dr. Megan Reitz's work, so much around corporate activism and the importance of the expectation that so many employees have for our employers to really take a stance on social justice issues, to speak up on the various issues that we're seeing. And I really think the return to office is one of those. I do think at its core, it is an issue of inclusion. It is an issue of social justice.
Yeah, Megan also talks about employees as activists. And I wonder if the last 18 months has confirmed to a lot of people that when they go back to work or whatever working environment they return to, that they have to behave like activists. Did you get a sense of that?
Absolutely. And I think people are voting with their feet. I am hearing from a lot of actually managers and hiring managers that new hires are turning down really lucrative offers because they don't want to go back into the office. And this employer has made an announcement that, you need to come back for X number of days a week. But I'm hearing that quite a lot, actually. And I think for the first time ever, people realize that we're really coming up with sort of a divided landscape, right? They're the employers that are allowing us to work from home and continue, sort of this cadence that we've already built. And for a lot of people, this is a wonderful way of living your life, where you have that choice, right? When do you go in at all? And I think the employers that are taking a much more heavy-handed approach, you have to return, need to come back these number of days a week, otherwise you're going to be penalized. I think they are going to struggle. I think they're going to struggle to hire, and I think they're definitely going to struggle to retain.
I mean, for those of us who've not worked in an office for a while, which I think, certainly speak with Stuart and I, it always did seem so strange that people, that employers weren't more open to people working from home and giving them flexibility. And if nothing else, the pandemic has accelerated that process, it would seem. But I mean, another interesting thing is how much of this stuff in terms of culture, but how many of these things are invisible. I think you wrote an article where, even the temperature at which the air conditioning is set is a sort of white male default. It's what people don't even see things like that. They're the invisible parts of culture. Hopefully this is an opportunity to reset. Yeah.
Correct. Yes. And I think that it's challenging sometimes to talk about, right? And it feels like these are the small things, right? Like, what's the temperature of the office? What's a big deal? Put on a jacket or put on a cardigan or whatever it is. But those little issues, they really compound to become a really big issue, right? Again, one of the things that I think I would love to see more research around is how much time women, and then compound that if you're a racial minority, but the amount of time women have to spend getting ready, right? And buying professional clothes and looking a certain way when they come into the office. Again, a lot of these standards are much more challenging to women of color. Black women talk about spending, hours and hours every day on their hair to appear, quote, professional, right? And these are white Eurocentric standards of beauty and professionalism. For example, the default has been male in the office. I'm really glad, Des, you brought up the temperature of the office, which again, seemingly seems like a very small, minute thing. But if that's your experience every day, you're going into the office and you're going to be uncomfortable, you're going to have to bring in extra layers and armor to feel comfortable. That's something that more employers need to think about. What's interesting is a lot of research shows that by making tweaks to be more gender neutral, like the office temperature, a lot of times men benefit too. I remember years ago, I was working with a client which had a very meeting heavy culture, and also a culture which was very sort of like, pound your fist. The louder you speak in a meeting, the more sort of room you're going to get. And certainly when I spoke to women in the organization, they talked about how that was very challenging, and they felt like they had to put on an additional, they had to put on a performance to be heard. But what was also really interesting is a lot of white men talked about how, as introverts, this culture never suited them, it never felt right to them, and they too felt uncomfortable, like they had to perform. And what had happened is that this organization, this team, had centered the few people who are naturally extroverted, who spoke really loudly, who sort of behaved in that way, and made that the default, rather than taking a more neutral approach, sort of coming up to a sort of the midpoint, which I think is something that we're all really trying to reach for. And look, frankly, someone like me, I'd be more than happy to return to a office, but at my own time, right? And this is another thing. Dr. Alia Hamid Rao, who I interviewed for the article, talked about one huge challenge was for a lot of women of color. We come from countries that have been really deeply impacted by, especially the variants. We've seen a huge loss of life. I've unfortunately lost family members too in other countries, and so for me, this idea of like rushing back at a date that's sort of a month or 2 months from now really doesn't feel comfortable in quite the same way. So I think there are a lot of different factors that I'd love employers to think about as they plan return to the office.
It's amazing when you think of it, how we've reached a situation. I mean, I don't think, Ezra, I would argue with anything you've said about the kind of picture you paint of how organizations behave with their terribly inefficient meetings, the lack of trust in the people who work there, the ongoing biases and prejudices, and the sheer discomfort. And how did we get here is the big question to me. That how I mean, if you think about the pandemic, what's astonishing really is that how well the economy has done, considering we've always been told that if you can't trust people, and if they work at home, everything will fall to pieces. But in fact, we know that if people work at home, they take pride in their work. They want to do a good job. So it's amazing that we got here, really, isn't it?
Not only that, Stuart, but the fact is we've not really innovated past the 1950s, in my opinion, right? And that's what research has shown, since the time where you were on an assembly line and you had a timesheet and all of that. But today's workplace is completely different. Let's not even talk about the technology. Honestly, the technology exists, but the vast majority of us don't ever have to actually go back into the office. And right now, the conversations I think that are being had about, oh, but what about collaboration? But oh, what about those serendipitous water cooler conversations, and things like that. I think we're really reaching, right? We're really trying to reach for something that I don't think really exists anymore, right? I think there are a lot of people who manage to connect with their coworkers, again, in really vulnerable and honest ways. I certainly have with the various people I work with, I think in very honest and vulnerable ways, again, because of that armor, because of that feeling of like, where's the hierarchy? Oh, I'm here on the hierarchy, you're there on the hierarchy. All of that has flattened in many ways in this work from home environment. I've seen people who have always thought of like, oh, I can't really be myself with them. I need to be less, authentic, or I need to put on, again, that armor, who've been really, they've invited me into their homes via their screens. I've seen their kids, I've seen their dogs, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that there's a real opportunity right now to innovate. And I think that's going to be the difference. I cannot stress this enough. I think that's going to be the difference between the employers and leaders of tomorrow and the ones we're going to leave behind sort of in the dust, honestly. I think the very last thing that I'll say is I think when we kind of go to that intersection of we trust our employees and we also understand that they're driven by purpose, they're driven by social justice. I remember, I think I read a statistic that something like 65% of employees expect their employers to take some sort of social justice stance on an issue, and that's quite large, and that's regardless of their political leanings. I do think I think there was a little bit of there was a slight bump in if an employee identified as politically liberal, they expected sort of them to take more of a stance. But even then, across the political spectrum, we see that employees are expecting employers to take a stance on issues. And so I think that purpose-driven workplace, the idea that millennials will leave a workplace that doesn't align with their values, or just not even go and work for an employer that doesn't align with their values, I absolutely see that. I mean, I teach at Seattle University. It is remarkable to me year after year how many of my students will say, I would never work for this employer or that employer or that employer. I remember being in university, and if anyone is offering me a job, I am not turning it down. I am not turning it down because my values don't align with that organization. But the times have changed.
I mean, as you say, the working from home, it has been a great leveler in some ways. Once we all got over ourselves a bit and just relaxed a little bit and allow people to see inside the window into our lives, really, which had been kept firmly shut. But let's flip this around a little bit. What is it about the office that we do need? I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Most of these things can be replicated. Is there anything fundamentally? I mean, the other great thing is that what working virtually has allowed us to do, as you say, is to be, we really are global citizens now, in the sense that we don't have to work for the company down the road. We have more choice in terms of the values that we align with, the organizations. So we can afford to say no to the company that's down the road because we can connect elsewhere. But is there something integral in the office environment that we do need, that we do crave as human beings, in your view?
I think the answer is no, actually. I actually think, I do think the answer is no. And I will say, because so much of my work and so much of the research I've done has focused on people for whom the office was a really tough place to be, right? I've largely focused my research and the work I do on women, on people of color, on people with other marginalized identities in the workplace. And no, for a lot of people I've spoken to for years, for the better part of the last decade, has been that no, they don't want to. They don't want to return to the office.
I saw a blog where you actually wrote that you used to go in on a Monday morning with your stomach in knots. That's a horrific situation. But
yes, indeed, and that was what it was like. So, and that is what it is still like for a lot of people. This idea, like, there's a real dread, and I think for so long we have centered the voices of, again, people who are the leaders and the CEOs who've gone in and been excited because, hey, it's their team, and hey, like, let's create this team camaraderie and spirit. But I didn't have that, and a lot of people haven't, and I'm so glad we're in a place where we can surface these views, because I remember back then thinking there was something wrong with me, and it's only now that I have realized that nope, it wasn't me, and research backs this up. Now, I want to say that there are things that leaders and, again, managers need to do. And that is, I think there are a lot of things we can take away from this time. And one of the key things is really check in with people. And I think we need to check in regularly with people, as we did during the pandemic. I saw this with innovative leaders, inclusive leaders doing this all the time. Let me check in with my folks, make sure they're okay. If they need a day off, if they need time off, forcing them to take a vacation. I got an email from Harvard Business Review this morning, and the subject line was "Take a vacation." I thought to myself, wow, this is not something I would have expected from like a premier, management journal telling me to take a vacation. Right? It's supposed to tell me how to work better. But I think we're all really realizing that the ways things were done was just not working. So I think the check-in is something that's here to stay. And I think innovative leaders will do a really good job of making sure that people are comfortable, all of that. And listen, if this is the chance to rebuild the office back better, maybe you and I, maybe the three of us are having this conversation, 5 years from now, and I'll say, huge innovation happened. Everyone, came back to the office in a way that was very inclusive, And now I'm hearing how everyone loves being in the office. So in some ways, we're talking about, I think, a future at this point, or an environment that I haven't personally seen yet.
There's a question from Mina Empoyo, who's in Brussels. How do you rebuild an inclusive culture remotely in an innovative way? I think what he's getting at there is a bit of a paradox, isn't there? In that we're working virtually, you are physically distant, but you want it to be an inclusive culture. It's a difficult balancing act.
I think it is a difficult balancing act, and yet I think that I have seen organizations do this. I've worked with teams that have done a good job of, again, sharing. Again, it's the accumulation of these small actions. This is why my next book is called Inclusion on Purpose. You take intentional, on purpose actions to build an inclusive work environment. This means things like sharing meeting time. It means making sure that, people who have not had a chance to speak at the big meeting or present, the big data or whatever it is for your organization, they get an opportunity to step up. It's talking about creating, times during the day where people really have the opportunity to step away from their desk, take lunch. There's this concept of leaders leaving visibly, which used to not happen in the office, right? In an in-office environment, I really, I work for an organization where it felt like a lot of the male leaders were in the office all the time. I'd come in at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., they were there. When I was leaving at 6 or 7 p.m., they were still there. And now in the virtual environment, I'm starting to see a lot of leaders actually say, no, actually, I have to leave. I'm gonna take my daughter out for a bike ride right now. We've been hunkered in at home all day. And it's really refreshing. So I think what we have learned from the last 1 year, the good parts of the last 1 year plus, I really hope we take back and rebuild in a very inclusive way.
Are you optimistic about the future? I mean, your work is obviously ongoing and seemingly never ending in some ways, but are you optimistic? Are we moving the needle? Has it moved at all?
I am. I'm extremely optimistic. Just being able to have this conversation in a forum like Thinkers50 to me tells me that we're very much moving in the right direction. I think that, again, 10 years ago, there's no way we'd be having this conversation, let's be honest now. So I love the fact that we can. I love the fact that as I look at the radar list every year, I get extremely excited. I see people, who I have long looked up to on it. I am very optimistic.
Good. I mean, we're very excited about the radar list too. It gets sort of more eclectic and more interesting every time. So it's a very exciting kind of aspect of our work, I think.
There's a nice comment from Keita Deming. Liz Elam, I was listening to this and thought about you. There's something poignant about that comment, I think. Thank you very much for that. And we are out of time. Ruchika Tulshyan, thank you very much. Ruchika's new book is called Inclusion on Purpose, published by MIT Press. It'll be out in February next year. But watch out for her upcoming articles in New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and a number of other places. Her work is essential reading, and she's always a joy to talk to. So, Ruchika, thank you very much. And next week, we're joined by Lisa Bodell. So, thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart and Des. Thank you all of you for tuning in.